Hello and welcome back to On the Soul's Terms podcast. Today we'll be entering the 6th house of the zodiac. We are making our way from the night world into the very edge of the day world today with the 6th. And so for the last month or so, we've been in the 5th house, the house of pleasure and enjoyment and creativity and fun. We've had a few interviews with Libby and Vive and talked about Persephone's journey, and with Vive we talked about creativity and that life force that comes from that, individuation, becoming oneself, all of these things that happen in the 5th. But from the 6th house point of view, things that happen in the 5th can get a little overdone and can be a little uncontained. And it's almost as though things that happen in the 5th house don't really know of any limits. The story that springs to mind when I'm referring to that are the two young boys of Greek mythology that end up crashing in to the earth from very big flights of fancy. One is the son of the sun god Helios, Phaethon, who drives his father's sun chariot through the sky without any idea of how to drive that thing. That is a child who has not done his 6th house work. He's not gathered up the skills. He's not worked on his craft. He's not thought that there was anything more to do but to show up and take the reins of these wild horses and fly them into the sky. And on the other hand, we have the son of Daedalus, who is Icarus, a very famous character who flies too close to the sun. But he also misses out on the 6th house. But with Icarus, his story isn't so connected to some hubris. In fact, Daedalus and Icarus are trapped in the labyrinth at the end of the story of the story that involves Ariadne and Theseus and the Minotaur and this great epic that goes on in Crete, in Minoan culture. And Daedalus is punished, and he and his son get trapped in there together. And even though Daedalus created the labyrinth, he designed it, he created it, he is its architect and he is its builder, it's such a brilliantly designed labyrinth that he does not know the way out. And so he and his son are trapped in there. And so Daedalus gets to work with his handicrafts and skills. Now, Daedalus is very much a 6th house figure who has the ability to create with his hands. He has the ability to make things happen. He has the ability to put all of his gifts and talents into physical form. And that really is the 6th house, putting our gifts and talents of the 5th that we may have found into their physical manifestation. And he creates quite beautiful things, Daedalus, mind-blowing things in a way. But he's often getting punished for the things that he creates, like this labyrinth. And so there he is in there with his son, and he creates the most exquisite wings, which he touches them to his upper back and shoulders is the way I often see it, and to the upper back and shoulders of his son with beeswax. But what he doesn't do is he does not teach his son how to fly. He does not train him in that 6th house way of exactly how we are supposed to use wings. He doesn't tell him how it is that we fly and how it is that we can get carried away up there. He does turn to his son and say, now remember, don't go too high and don't go too low. These are also very 6th house themes. He does turn to his son and say that to him through words, but he never shows him that. He never guides him in the way that a mentor needs to guide a student, or a father perhaps needs to guide a son in this situation. He just says, don't fly too high, don't fly too low, and follow me through the sky. Just make sure you follow me through the sky. He's got tears in his eyes as he's telling his son this, but it's just words. And of course, when the young Icarus gets out into the sky, he loses track of his father who's flown on ahead. And Daedalus, having done much sixth house work in his life, being a very sixth house figure in mythology, is able to fly that middle path. And Icarus is clearly not able to fly it. The way we tend to see Icarus is that he stares up at the sky and so mesmerized by the sun that he can't help it, like a moth to the flame, and he starts flying towards his own doom. And as he gets closer and closer to the sun, the wax that holds his wings together begins to melt, and he falls down to the sea. But I like the treatment that Clarissa Pinkola Estes gave this story. And she suggested that instead of flying up and up looking for the light, he started doing fancy tricks in the sky and showing off, and essentially, like the child that he is, he's locked in the fifth house. He's just enjoying himself, having a grand old time out there. And as he swoops down, he gets so close to the water, so close to the unconscious, that his wings get wet, and that stresses him out. And so he has a great idea that if he can get closer to the sun, he might be able to dry his wings off, and perhaps that'll work. And so he flies up higher and higher, and it does work for a while. He does actually dry out his wings, but then he gets closer and closer still to the sun, and then indeed the wax does melt, and his wings fall off, and he tumbles back down to the water, down to the unconscious. It's the fate of both Phaethon and Icarus, in that they end up back in the water, which is to say, in our journey of the houses, that they haven't been able to make the night journey. The night journey of the house system is from the first through to the sixth, because instead of getting born and going up, in the houses we get born and we go down. So we go down those first 6 houses before we see the light of day. And as we heard with our exploration of the fifth house, we have finally broken free and explored our talents, but we have yet to explore our limits. And that's what we're doing with the sixth. That's what we're doing in this house. You may be leaving behind the grand palace of your fifth house, or the big creative playroom of the fifth, the playground perhaps. And as we leave this house behind and head off into our trail, into the forest, we see this sixth house. And as always with our series of the houses, you can imagine, what house is this? What does it look like? If you know your astrology, you may see the door, and that is the sign on the cusp of this house is written on that door. And you can get curious about that sign and the ruler of that sign and follow it around the chart. And then as you open, you may see the planets or the aspects of the ruler of this house. And that will tell you what's going on in here. What is your relationship to this house? In the ancient world, or at least in the Hellenistic world, this was considered to be not such a good house. It was called the house of bad fortune. This is because it has a 150-degree angle to the ascendant. And the ascendant, as we've talked about before, is really the cornerstone of the personality, the persona, which is the root of the word personality. And so what happens in the sixth, because it's a 150-degree angle, that is referred to as an inconjunct or a quincunx in the world of astrology. So that 150-degree angle that leads to the first house of the ascendant, it's kind of like if you were driving in a car and you're driving forward, and what's at a 150-degree angle to you as you drive forward is, of course, the blind spot. So the sixth house becomes a blind spot, and the Hellenistic astrologers ran with that and went so far as to say this house was a declining house, or it was not holding any power, and that it was dark and unseen. And the fact that Mars rejoices here, Mars is in its joy here, which we'll get into a little bit later, But the way that was seen in the ancient world with Mars as a malefic is that it would cause conflict and injury and illness and inflammation. And then the 6 is therefore picking up those martial qualities of struggle and hard work and pain. And then traditionally it was then signified that this was the house of illness and accidents and servitude and slavery and small animals. And small animals came up here as that was considered to be an unfortunate condition for birth. So yes, in that Hellenistic period, the technical label was kakos daimon, or a bad spirit or bad fortune. And it's contrasted with the 11th house of agathos daimon, which is good spirit. These are the terms from the Hellenistic period that were picked up by these later Roman astrologers who obviously had a pretty bad idea of what it was to be in the 6th. This is from Valens in the 2nd century CE. If Mars rules the 6th, it causes wounds and diseases, and it makes naked beggars who come to a miserable end. So that is not such a good view of the 6th here. And Firmicus Maternus in the 4th century CE, the 6th house is described as the house of physical infirmities and sickness, calling it mala fortuna or bad fortune. But maybe as modern astrologers, we can have a look at that from the context of what was happening in the world of astrology at the time and how everything was put in, it was starting to get put in the context of good and bad or light and dark. Of course, if we're able to free ourselves from this black and white approach and free ourselves from what was occurring, not just in astrology, but philosophically at the time, where the night world was being denigrated and the day world was being celebrated, we could look at it as, say, the Grimm brothers' story of the 12 dancing princesses. These princesses by day are being good princesses in light of the king, and by night they sneak out and they put on their dancing shoes and they find their way through the basement of the castle and end up in a magical land where they dance all night. So there are certain things that can happen without the somewhat oppressive view of the king that can be quite joyful in the world of the night. So we need to free ourselves, not to diminish the worldview, but to understand the worldview of the Hellenistic astrologers and those in the first few centuries of the Roman era as well, and the way they were viewing reality and the leaning in towards the day world being the good thing and the night world being the bad thing. So with that in mind, as we enter the 6th house, as we really go into this house and feel our way into it, what really is it then? I am starting to like the idea that it is out of the way of the ascendant, that the personality doesn't have much to do with this house, and therefore it's not going to be anything particularly glamorous. It's not going to do something for the great recognition. It's not going to stand out there in the world and make a big thing of itself. It's not going to really crave that approval from the external world. So it's something in this house that we're doing almost because we must. There's almost a compulsion to this house, maybe in the good way and the bad way. And just as we heard there that Mars is in its joy here, and therefore there may be something of a negative impulse in this house, there's also very clearly a positive impulse in this house. Next week I'll be releasing my interview with Kira Sutherland, who's coming back on the show to talk about the 6th. And we talk a lot about Mars in this house and the celebration of, that it's really hard work to keep good health, and it's hard work to keep good routines in your life. And Mars being a signifier of that, of being willing to do that hard work, being willing to do what is necessary to create the best conditions that we can for good health in our lives. But we may be able to hear in the examples of Icarus and Phaethon at the beginning, the question really becomes, how much is enough? the fifth house, these young boys, the puer aeternis that I talked about in the fifth house episode, they don't really know much about enough at that point. And so the sixth house is where we learn that. We're putting what we know into the earthy realm, and therefore we're finding out how much is enough. And then how do I develop the skills and the tools that are necessary for me to really enter the world? It's almost like the old idea of taking on an apprenticeship or having a mentor figure in your life that can show you what is necessary, teach you the tools of the trade, essentially. That's the sort of thing that happens here in the sixth. The deity that really springs to mind and will be someone that will take with us through this exploration of the sixth is, of course, Artemis, both in the sense of that she's the virgin Virgoan goddess, and so she is the figure of self-containment, but also with Mars in its joy here, she is that huntress, and she is out in the wild. She is very skilled as a huntress, and she has a bow and arrow, and she has her hunting clothes on, and she has the ability to go out into harsh conditions and stay out there in the world and endure certain things as we have to in the sixth. And she obviously has a big, long laundry list of skills at her disposal. So yes, it's that huntress that has also, her connection to the rhythms of nature. She is a lunar goddess. So by her nature, then she is connected to those rhythms. She knows when to hunt. She knows when to rest. She knows also how much to take of the natural world and what to leave behind, so that there's always an abundant fertility in the world, that she's not taking too much at any point. And she also has by her side the dogs, her hunting dogs. And that's another element to this house, of the sixth house. This is where our pets are. This is those small animals that the Hellenistic world frowned upon as terrible ways to be incarnated into this life. But I think we know our connection to our pets is a very special connection. There's nothing quite like it. There's often something that we can get from the animal world that we just can't seem to receive from the human world. And so also with these dogs, just as on a more metaphorical level, they're also an outpouring of Artemis's instincts. They are her connection to the instinctive life. And I think ultimately that's what the sixth is also trying to do, is to get us connected to our instinctual life. There's something of the sixth as a distinction from the fifth, where the fifth is busy saying, I can do anything, I can be anything. I'm sort of this limitless figure, and anything I put my hand to, I can do well at. And the sixth isn't really interested in that. The sixth is trying to grow simply into who I actually am. What is my nature? And how do I focus on what I am and leave behind what I am not? And therefore, there's that real discernment, so that we're not wasting our time and wasting our energy and putting our energy towards things that are really never going to bear fruit. And so those things that are never really going to bear fruit, they remain in the fifth, but the things we want to bring into the world, we're going to have to bring into the sixth. We're going to have to learn the tools of the trade, and we're going to have to get in touch with our instincts and give our instincts form in the form of rhythms and rituals and even routines. It's the whole chop wood, carry water thing. That's this house here, where we get into the sixth and we just get busy. We get busy learning. We get busy with our trade, we get busy with our teachers and mentors, and we develop the skills necessary. Now, as a counterpoint to Artemis, it's a character that I've talked about on the show before, so I won't go into too much depth. If you want to hear that in more depth, you could listen to my episode on Artemis and Orion, particularly the show I do with Jason Holly in Scorpio season a few years ago. We talk about Artemis and Orion and their love affair and everything that happens between them there. There were many different versions of Orion. He's very recognizable in the night sky as the constellation, and there were cults dedicated to him. And so I want to start with a disclaimer that this is not the only Orion who I'm talking about here. I'm really talking about Orion in terms of a juxtaposition to Artemis and then Gaia. a juxtaposition to the natural laws and the natural ways, and an illustration, or I'll be using it as an illustration of a part of nature that doesn't know its limits and therefore becomes destructive. So in the story of Artemis and Orion, Orion has been sent by a king to destroy all wilderness. And he's a giant, and he's quite beautiful, and he has amazing talent and skills when it comes to the hunting world. And therefore Artemis, which is very out of character for her, this is where Artemis almost slips out of the sixth and into the fifth and drops out of her natural character and goes into a romantic zone. It's almost like she's been struck with the arrow of Eros in this story, which normally would not affect her at all, but Eros has somehow affected her, and she's fallen for Orion, of all people, mainly because of his skill and his craft and his abilities. So she sees the sixth houseness in him, but she is unable to see the fifth houseness in what he's up to, in that he really doesn't have any limits, or he's purposefully not having limits, in that he's been sent by the king to destroy everything. And so there's many different versions to the story. And if you'd like to learn more about that, you can go, as I said, you can go back to the podcast that we did on Artemis and Orion, or you can have a search online about their story. But there's one version that I've discovered more recently, and that version is that Gaia herself sees that the wilderness is in terrible danger with this figure that just does not know its own place, his own place in the circle of life, so therefore has no relationship to the sixth house at all. And so she sends the scorpion. She sends the scorpion after him. And even now, if you see Orion on one side of the sky, so if you see Orion setting, you know that Scorpio will be rising at that same moment, and vice versa, because the scorpion is hounding Orion for all of eternity. And Gaia has put that into our sky, we might imagine, so that we might remember, as moderners in the throes of an industrial revolution that has gone a bit haywire, that we also have limits, that we have to remember that there's a sixth house here, that we can't just take without consequences, and that even though we might imagine ourselves through some kind of fantasy that we are outside of the circle of life, that is not possible. Just as it's impossible to be outside of this circle of animals, impossible to be outside of the zodiac, this medicine wheel is where we live. So we might imagine that a world obsessed with individualism and me, may easily forget its limits and its relationship to the more than human world, or even the human world, and just be in the form of greed and take, and essentially killing off all wildness. I just want to return here to the animal helpers. I think I've said this many times on the podcast, but I think it bears repeating that one of the things Marie-Louise von France found when she was researching fairy tales, of which she researched extensively, fairy tales from all over the world, was the one rule that she found that was an immutable rule, was that if an animal helper came to the service of the protagonist in the story, things would always work out for the best, no matter what. A friendly animal helper is all you really needed for things to work out for the best. And I think that is really a sixth house theme here. It's not a heroic house. More so, it's a house where we have to drop down out of our heroic self into a more humble, even humiliated at times, version of ourselves, and rely on the more than human world to come and help us, which is to say, to rely on our instinctive life, to rely on something deeper, our felt sense. This happens both in the story of Cinderella and Psyche. In Cinderella, the stepmother throws lentils into the ashes and tells her to separate out the good and the bad lentils. That's the sifting and sorting of the sixth house. What's worth keeping, and what should I really throw away out of the ashes, and therefore out of the what's left behind by the hearth, right? What's being burned up by the hearth, again, of the fifth house. inside of those ashes are the lentils, and we need to figure out what's worth keeping and what's worth throwing away. And Cinderella cannot do that, and so she relies on the help of the birds that come to her rescue, and they do that easily for her. And that's also mirrored in the fairy tale / myth, I'd say more of a fairy tale, from Apuleius in his book The Golden Ass, where we see the story of Psyche and Eros. And in that story as well, Psyche is asked to sift and sort. Aphrodite, who's playing the role of evil stepmother in this story, throws down a big mountain of seeds, and Psyche is asked to separate those seeds out into its 9 distinct piles. And it's the ants that come this time. The smallest of the small animals come to help her out, and they easily do the job in the background as Psyche rests. So you can see it's not heroic. If you were to have this theme come up in a modern day movie, it would be lambasted on YouTube as a really poor plot device because the heroine didn't have to do anything. But that's to not really see what's occurring there. The heroine in the story is doing something. She is actively engaged, but also in the process of surrender and giving up. And in her surrender and giving up, she makes some space for the instincts to kick in, and they do kick in the sense of the animal kingdom coming to her rescue. And I find those stories very, very sixth house stories. When we're doing our sixth house work, just like Psyche and Cinderella, we're out of the view. We are not at the big banquet or the ball. We are out of the view of the king. We're out of the view of the personality and the ascendant. We're not doing something glamorous at all. But we're doing something perhaps even more essential than that. And we're doing that sifting and sorting work. We're finding our way towards greater sanity. And we're essentially finding a way to become at peace with ourselves, to know our limits and to stay within our own frame and to become self-contained. And that's really the image given to us by these stories, but also by Artemis herself. Perhaps even by Helios and Daedalus as those father figures. They're contained inside of their roles, but their sons are not contained inside of their roles. And Artemis is very much contained inside of her declaration for her dedication to nature. And she loses that container in her love affair with Orion. She loses her sense of containment and a sense of who she truly is in that dilemma that she finds herself in. So finally, I just want to talk about the sixth house and health, because it is the house of health. And that's why we'll be talking with medical astrologer Kira Sutherland next week. And we'll be getting much deeper into this. But I just wanted to bring in a few characters that I associate with the sixth. Firstly, the daughter of Asclepius, the patron god of On the Soul's Terms. The daughter of Asclepius, his name is Hygeia, and we obviously recognize that as hygiene. So she's that representation of hygiene and prevention and daily care that go into the sixth. Preventative medicine, essentially. Eating the right things, doing the right things, getting enough sunlight, getting enough moonlight, these things that follow along with nature. And Hygeia is also an asteroid, so you can pull that up on your chart. If you go to astro.com, you can pull up Hygeia on your chart and see what house she arises in, what sign she's in, and that'll give you a better sense of her and maybe a better linking back to the sixth through where she is in your chart. I also see Chiron here in his natural essence, in that he is not separate from the animal world. He's still half horse as well as being half human. And Chiron, as we know, means hands. And so he works with his hands. So this is a house where it's, like Virgo, it's a mercurial house in a way, but it's more to do with the wisdom of the hands than it is to do with the wisdom of the mind and what the hands know. I think that's why Daedalus came up at the beginning of this podcast, because Daedalus is someone who really does represent that figure who works with his hands. Of course, within Chiron's story, we see that the wounding of Chiron happens at the hands of Hercules, who's the great solar hero. So again, we can kind of sense that, this sixth house, it actually desires to be out of the view of the personality. Just like Chiron, who spent his whole life in caves, just tinkering with things and working on his own thing. He didn't really want to be seen by the king. He didn't really want to be up in Mount Olympus. In fact, every time he did venture up there, it didn't work out so well for him, and all chaos reigned. So he ended up back in the cave, and that's how sixth house work. You can imagine. I mean, Chiron lived for 800 years, so imagine those skills that he had. Yes, he was gifted. He had those gifts from the fifth, but he also honed them over the course of his life. He had one of the great mentors that you could ever have in Apollo. But he also had the mentors of the natural world. He had the trees talking to him and the animals talking to him, and was very much connected and in there. So he becomes a very great figure of the sixth house, in service to something greater all the time, and certainly in service to healing and health, and even in service to the heroes, such as Achilles and Jason and Asclepius and others that came his way. He was always willing to help the heroes, but not himself to be one of them, because his place was really in the sixth. So yeah, I hope you can hear from the sixth house exploration here that we have a few strong themes. Like the sixth house is perhaps the ecology of the body, that we have within ourselves a whole world, maybe even a whole universe, that needs to stay in balance. And if things go out of balance, and if we get into an Orion state of mind, then we need Artemis to step back in and help us find that balance again. Of course, we don't want to become obsessive with that either. I want to mention that as a shadow of the sixth, how we can become too heady and too mindy. We can become perfectionists, and we've got to watch for that other angle of the sixth where we're trying to get it exactly right, and we don't give ourselves any time for the fun and the joy and the play. And at times like that, at times where any of these houses are going a little bit astray, maybe we need to dip into the house before to get a sense of like why we're doing this in the first place. And so fifth house, although I've talked about that the sixth is an answer to the fifth, it's not exactly a one-way street like that. I think once something is going awry in one of these houses, we can dip down to the house before it to get us to get some medicine for that. And so perhaps if we get into, I'm obviously reminded here of what I see as like the negative side of the sixth, like the character Sisyphus, who's rolling his big boulder up the hill and it rolls down every day. So what's he doing? Why is he doing that? He's doing that because he's been punished. And why was he punished? Because he chained up death. And in his chaining up of death, he also went against the natural order of things, and that was his punishment. And so he's not connected to life because he's in denial of death. And so he is punished, and his everyday work has become a grind, pretty much the quintessential grind, rolling the boulder up the hill, watching it roll down again. There's not a whole lot of joy in that. Although if you do read Albert Camus, he does talk about the rock as his thing. And so he does actually talk about even the joy that can be found in that. So I'll post a link to that article, and thankful for a client of mine who put me onto that article a few years ago. So yeah, of course we can even find joy in the Sisyphus, but I think he's also a pretty good image for when we've lost the joy in our everyday life and we need to do something to revive it. So other elements of this house, maintenance, this is a house of maintaining. If we can make that devotional, if we can turn these routines into rituals, it can create a very beautiful and rich life. And so I think that's also the promise of the sixth. We've got to remember in this house our limits and the habits that we have, and making sure that we're paying attention to our habitual life, and making sure our habits aren't getting destructive. And then, it's really the small and the humble and the repetitive, and all of those things can be sacred. As I said, cut wood, carry water exists in this sixth house. And it also prepares us for the seventh. So the next big threshold we will cross is the descendant, another angle, and we'll be heading up into the day world. from this first half of the time in the night world. And when we head up into the house that is essentially Libra's domain, we're bound to meet Aphrodite there, Artemis's nemesis. Aphrodite wants us in communion and connection with people. Artemis would prefer that we stay self-contained. And so there is the tension point of the descendant. And hopefully we've done enough in the 6th house to get us ready for that disturbing force that is the 7th, and opening up to this whole other world of the other and the others. And that's coming soon. And I'm excited to say that Brian Clark will be joining me again for next month. I think we may be able to record our session live, as I'll be in Melbourne in a few weeks, and Brian and I will be able to sit down and record this together. And we will talk about the second half of the houses, the second journey, and just as we did the first half a few months ago when all of this began. So very much looking forward to that. As I said, Kira will be coming up next week, and the week after that, of course, we'll have a fairy tale. And we'll have to see which fairy tale arises this time. Thanks for joining me. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.